All right. Today, we're diving into a really powerful concept from historian George Lipsitz, and it's called the possessive investment in whiteness.
So let's start way back in 1946. The author Richard Wright completely flipped a common phrase on its head with this quote. So what was he getting at? Well, the sources we're looking at today argue that Wright was pointing out a hidden assumption, the idea that racial inequality is somehow caused by the presence of black people. He argued that no, you have to look at the systems and behaviors of the dominant white society. It totally shifts your focus. So what is this possessive investment in whiteness? At its core, it's the idea that whiteness isn't just, an identity. It's been treated like an asset. The argument is that for a long, long time, U.S. laws and policies have protected and even grown the value of being white, giving it a real, tangible cash value that has shaped everything. To really get this, let's start with what Richard Wright was talking about, this so-called white problem.
A key idea in the source material is this concept of invisibility. Think about it like this. Whiteness often gets to be the default setting, the norm. It's the unmarked category that everything else is measured against. And because of that, its own role and how society is set up can be really, really hard to see.
So how did this investment even get started? Well, to see how it was built, we've got to go back to the 19th century and look at a working class that was deeply, deeply divided. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln laid out what was basically the American dream of that era. This quote, which W.E.B. Du Bois later cited, captures this incredibly powerful idea that any white worker could, with enough hard work, climb that ladder from employee to business owner. This wasn't just a fantasy, it was seen as the true system. But, and this is a huge but, that dream existed right alongside a totally different, brutal reality. For the white laborer, the name of the game was upward mobility. For the enslaved black laborer, their status was permanent. They were legally property. This set up a fundamental economic clash. White workers, especially new immigrants, were terrified of having to compete with a huge labor force that, because they were enslaved, could never be underbid. And this fear had absolutely devastating consequences. As Du Bois explains, it drove a massive wedge between two groups that could have been allies. Instead of uniting to fight exploitation, many white labor movements actually opposed abolition. And this wasn't just talk. This tension exploded into violent riots, where white workers attacked black communities, blaming them for their low wages. The end result? The movement for labor rights and the movement for abolition were split right down the middle. So this split in the 1800s really laid the groundwork for what happened in the 20th century. This is when those dynamics got baked into the very structure of American policy. Let's take a look at how this invisible system was actually built. Now, this is a really crucial turning point. We see a shift from just general attitudes to actual official government policy. George Lipsitz argues that even major reforms like the New Deal, policies that look race-neutral on the surface, were often written and implemented in ways that actively built up and protected the value of whiteness. Okay, home ownership. It's pretty much the main engine for building wealth that you can pass down in America, right? Well, here's how federal policy basically decided who got the keys to that engine. The FHA was created to make it easier for people to get home loans, but its own internal manuals used explicitly racist logic. They literally redlined neighborhoods with what they called inharmonious racial groups, labeling them as too hazardous for loans. The result? A flood of federal money subsidized the creation of new, segregated white suburbs, while at the same time, communities of color were locked out of the #1 way to build family wealth. And this isn't just a theory. Let's look at a concrete example from the source material. In the St. Louis area, between 1943 and 1960, the mostly white county got 5 times more FHA-backed mortgages than the more racially mixed city. 5 times. According to Lipsitz, this wasn't some accident. It was a direct result of federal policy and action. And it didn't stop with housing loans. You had other huge federal programs working together. So-called urban renewal projects destroyed twice the percentage of housing for black residents as they did for whites. Brand new federally funded highways were often routed to plow right through the middle of minority neighborhoods. When you add it all up, you get a physical reshaping of the country, creating a situation where even as recently as 1993, the vast majority of suburban whites lived in almost total racial isolation. So, you build a system like this over decades. You can bet it's going to have some very real, very measurable consequences that we can still see today. And that brings us to what the sources call the price of whiteness. And the effects show up in some really startling ways.
A 1992 study on EPA enforcement found that the fines for polluters were 500% higher in white communities than in minority communities. And this wasn't about money, it was about race. It suggests that a cash value was even being put on the environment people lived in.
And these kinds of gaps are still around today. Studies cited by Lipsitch show that even when you have the exact same credit score, minority loan applicants are way more likely to be turned down. I mean, in a lot of cities, high-income black applicants get denied more often than low-income white applicants. The system has created this warped market where the same house in the same neighborhood can literally have a different price tag depending on the race of the person buying it.
So all of this data, it reveals this huge gap, right? A gap between what a lot of people think is happening and what the data and the sources actually shows. Polls show most white Americans believe opportunity is equal. But the data shows that when 86% of jobs are found through personal networks, the historical advantages baked into those networks really matter. Lipsitz argues that this disconnect happens because we tend to think of racism as just individual acts of hate instead of a whole coordinated system.
Which brings us to our last section. What does it actually mean to see all of this clearly, right here in the present?
Okay, so if there's one core argument to take away from the source material, it's this. If we only define racism as conscious, hateful acts by a few bad apples, we completely miss the bigger picture. It's like staring at a single tree and missing the entire forest. The much larger, more powerful system, the one built through decades of policy, becomes totally invisible.
Lipsitz uses this quote from the philosopher Walter Benjamin to really drive the point home. The argument is that what we need isn't to predict the future, but to have presence of mind, a really sharp, clear-eyed awareness of how the systems built in the past are working right here, right now.
And that really leaves us with a big question to chew on. If this whole system was built, brick by brick, through laws and policies over generations, what does it actually take for us to see its architecture clearly today?
And in the end, what the sources are really getting at is that this isn't about making people feel guilty for a past they didn't create. It's about something else entirely. It's about achieving a sharp, precise awareness of the present, of the architecture of inequality that's still standing, so we can actually understand the world we're living in right now.